Now this is Chapter 8 in Intro to Politics, Political Culture, and this goes somewhat in tandem with Chapter 7 where we talked about democracy. Now when it comes to describing political culture, one of the interesting aspects of our culture was recognized many years ago in Tocqueville's very famous work, Democracy in America. And despite considerable economic progress, technological innovation, and immigration, he said that this individuality and freedom of this American culture, we see that the type of culture that Tocqueville described is still very recognizable today. Now, to give you an example of political cultures and their varying degrees of development, Table 8.2 has an interesting comparison between some states where, for example, the percent who believe they could do something about an unjust law is 57% in America, where it's only 35% in Italy. And as far as the percent of people who have ever signed a petition, you can see that 75% have in Britain, whereas only 31% have in Mexico. So you can see some interesting differences there as how political cultures have evolved. Now, the look at cultural values in a society runs along a couple of different spectrums here. The traditional versus rational spectrum shows that values tend to range from the overriding emphasis of a religion, authority, and family versus the secular values and tolerance of change, that sort of thing. This is type of values that we see in America of that sort of spectrum. Now, in many underdeveloped countries, we see a somewhat more of a different spectrum due to their lack of development, which we've talked about quite a bit so far, and that's the survival versus self-expression spectrum, to where poor societies, for various reasons, have to emphasize security because they are not developed enough to look at other things. But once these basic survival needs have been met, then these societies can start putting more emphasis on post-materialist type concerns, such as the environment, freedoms of speech and expression, the participation in the political process, and the more tolerance for diversity. So those are a couple of spectrums that we see typically among developed countries here, traditional versus rational, versus underdeveloped countries, survival versus self-expression. Now, much of this work has been based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This is a very well-received study of modernization of various cultures in the world, and this is what we kind of see with political development and modernization as well, is that first of all, the physiological needs need to be met of food, sleep, and sex. And then once those needs are met, we go to security, where we're looking for stable home, jobs, and health. And then once those needs are met, we can start looking at social relationships of being needed and wanted and loved and loving and that sort of thing. And then as with those needs are met, we start looking at other needs of recognition, of feeling importance, of status, and things like this. And at the top of Maslow's hierarchy is called self-actualization, which is generally very difficult to meet, but that has to do with where you are totally fulfilled with your purpose here on earth. You're doing what you were meant to be here to do. You have achieved some form of full enlightenment or wisdom, that sort of thing. So a lot of this work over here that we're talking about with looking at political development and modernization and democratization kind of follows along these same lines of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Now, political socialization is part of our upbringing, to where our parents in particular, or in, of course, school and other authority figures, are leading to our development of factual assumptions of the world, of how the world works and what we need to expect, that sort of thing. It also starts to develop our trust in people and authority and authoritarian figures, institutions, things like that. So this is part of the socialization process, is to get acclimated into this society, particularly ours, that has a very developed political democratic culture, as to how to perform in that culture. As we see, parental influence declines. This is somewhat ironic, is that as soon as our interest in politics and how society works starts to emerge, this is when parental influence starts to decline. But of course, parents have also been very instrumental in planting the fundamental values into our psyche. And then as we grow old, we will probably still rely on a lot of that. I've already talked a little bit about how some of our decision making and our intelligence is genetic. But then as we get older, we start to develop our views of politics. And we see that peers are not as prominent an influence on politics. Peers are fulfilling other needs for human beings. And though we may tend to associate with people that agree with us on politics, that not necessarily a prominent influence on our views of the world. Religion is a very influential factor. We do know that in the United States, the influence of religion is waning. We're down into the low 70% of people that consider themselves active church members are Christian faith supporters. However, it remains politically relevant because the religion is somewhat of a foundation for your own values. So on particular issues, those religious values that you were brought up with, even though you may not be practicing or worshiping a religion, they're still very relevant. And we have seen that, particularly along the conservative right, that religion has somewhat solidified some of the views on the conservative right into the spectrum there that may have contributed to increased polarization over the last few decades. Religion also serves as a pushback to some of these values that may be going away, particularly family values. As more and more we see more and more people living together unmarried, having children without being married. There's various alternative lifestyles. It also pushes back against the sexualization of our society, particularly in the media and our entertainment sector, where it starts to get a little bit more tolerant of more explicit views or descriptions of sexuality. So there's a continual pushback on that. And we also see that religion or religious values have ability to organize just like any other type of motive could be organized and pursued and advocated on the internet or through other types of media. Now, some other aspects of religion, particularly with the Islam religion, that does have some sectarian divisions that have resulted in quite a bit of conflict over the past couple of decades. We also see that the Islamic faith, particularly in the Middle Eastern region, has somewhat resisted against this modernization of society, particularly if it's considered to be westernized values and westernized political systems that seem to be pushed on them. Again, women's rights is a big issue in these regions, religious doctrines, not just Islam, but most religious doctrines do tend to put women subordinate to men. So therefore, the push for women's rights is considered extremely important to the development of countries, whereas you still may be seeing a resistance to that, particularly along some religious lines. There's been talk of a clash of civilizations, and while this may be true and to some degree, we do see that there's a lot more conflict within these religions and within these societies than there are between religions and between societies. We've seen the bulk of the conflict, particularly in the Islamic regions, is the Sunni versus Shia divide. We also see that there's very similar viewpoints on the concept of development and democracy. For example, U.S. and Jordan are very similar in their support for democracy, while because of these religious values that they've been socialized into, we see a pretty significant difference in social values. And this can be seen on table 8.3, where you see that is it important to live in a democracy? Both societies, after being polled, are in the 80% range. Both strongly agree. But however, when you look at social values, there is a big, broad divide on these issues such as homosexuality, abortion, and gender rights. So while there is some converging on various goals as far as democracy and development, the social values are still very far apart, and the religious socialization has something to do with this. Now, social capital is the term for the strength of your civil society, which we've talked about a little bit before. The civil society is very important makeup of a state that supplies the members of government. It maintains that skepticism of government while at the same time supporting government. Social capital has a large tendency to be defined in terms of voluntary involvement, where you're binding people to give political resources and mutual trust. So any type of club or organization or union or even choirs, service organizations such as the PTA, church membership, those are all examples of social capital. Now, there's been lots of studies on this joining type motif that America was very strong in, particularly post World War II, in the development of our very successful capitalist democratic structure. We do see that this social capital, at least in terms of joining and being members of clubs and things like that, does show to be diminishing. But we do see that that is being countered by increases in the rates of volunteerism, as well as the opportunity of a new type of social interaction through social networking and the digital connections of the computer. So again, there's no right or wrong ways for your civil society to interact, but we are seeing some interesting transitions here where people are moving more from face-to-face clubs and then over to social networking and interacting through digital media. Now, this page is simply just a review for the most part of what we talked about in the last chapter is the conditions for a political culture. This goes hand in hand with being a democratic citizen. We see that there has to be a reasonable tolerance for diversity. We talked about that in terms of the democratic bargain, that all these subcultural elements are going to agree to abide by the end result of government, able to get enough of what they want for the time being. Also, elections and voting, very important part of being a democratic system. Even communicating with your representative, serving on political committees, things like that. We also see that a high interest in the process and reliable information of the process is important for democratic citizenry to know what's going on. Because if you pursue action that has very little effect, it's same as being aimless. So we have to know what's going on and then pursue that accordingly if we want to initiate change for the better or reform. And again, here's that concept of the balance where the civil society and the democratic citizen supports the state while at the same time maintains a skeptical eye so that they do not get too powerful. Now, there is a growing difference between the United States and the Europe in their cultural values. The EU is suspicious of the United States' unilateral use of power, as most other countries are, but the EU, which shares our Western capitalist society apparatus, so to speak, is becoming more suspicious of that. And we see that in Europe, since there's much smaller nations tightly packed together, and because of the history of their conflict, they have more established systems of multilateral cooperation, EU being one of the best examples of that, even though it is having some problems. We'll talk about that a little bit more later on. Now, on the other side of that spectrum, the United States feels somewhat of a responsibility for being a hegemonic power. Now, a hegemon would be a sole superpower in this global system, of which the United States could be considered that at this time. And the United States, because of its individuality and freedoms and its representative government, it doesn't feel as hemmed in by the rule of committees that you do typically see in parliamentary systems or prime minister systems as opposed to presidential systems. And so that's some basic differing views as far as cultural values go amongst countries that have the same general origin. So how are these cultural requirements being met? Now, if we look at the United States in particular, we see some concerns here. An increased partisanism, whereas the loyalty to the two major political parties has become even more locked in, and we see even more ideological gridlock to where problems can't be solved and policies are not being put together and passed in a very divisive Congress, or that there's a Congress that's led by a party that's different from the president, which is not necessarily that bad because that can promote a little bit more deliberation and more well thought out policy. But that's not what we're seeing here. We're seeing just literally active resistance against working together. Certainly a concern. We might be seeing also a little bit of increase in tolerance towards immigration, towards refugees, towards increasing diversity. There is evidence of that, and yet America is almost exclusively 99% a nation of immigrants that have come together into this so-called melting pot and evolved together under these political values that have been very successful, relatively speaking, because most other countries that are, most other countries have a tendency to be more homogeneous than the United States. And the United States has become very successful, very powerful, in spite of being very multicultural. That's one of its strengths as well as one of its proudest accomplishments, you could say. And if there is growing intolerance, that certainly could be a concern. We're starting to see potential marginalized groups that lack political strength. Women are gaining power, but we still see there's minority groups that hold a disproportionate share of certain elements of society, such as the prison system, are being perhaps profiled or singled out more as far as the police involvement, very controversial issue that we're dealing with right now. And the poor, of course, lack political strength in general because they cannot organize, they do not have the funds to create interest groups, things like that. So these groups remain marginalized. Now, informal economy simply means that you're making a living off the books, where the government really has no idea what you're doing. There's you're skirting licensing requirements, standards, regulations, and paying of taxes, that sort of thing. Approximately 8% of the United States economy is informal, and it could be rising, particularly since the Great Recession in 2007, 2008, in that been a long, slow recovery, and our economy has actually changed somewhat since that to where more people are relying on part-time jobs or even informal jobs to make ends meet. But we do see this informal economy is the majority in most of the poor countries of the world. As much as 70 to 80% of the entire workforce in some countries. There's Egypt and Nigeria, and even Mexico is considerably higher percentage-wise than the United States. But the government is therefore less involved in its citizenry, less revenue being generated for infrastructure. So there's lots of negatives to a growing informal economy. And again, we may be seeing a little bit of that increasing in the United States. We also know that there's a considerable lack of participation in the United States. Almost one half of eligible voters in the United States don't even vote for the president, which is highly publicized in that literally everybody has heard of it and knows who's running. But again, almost half the people don't bother to do that. Only about 10% of the United States are politically active as far as serving on some kind of organization that has political issues at its core. And we do know that the average citizen is really not that well informed as to really what's going on in their own country or the history of our country or what policy is being pursued or what policy even needs to be pursued. We also see considerable lack of women being represented politically, not to mention economically when you see that only about 4% of all the top CEOs of the United States are women. But the United States actually in women in political representation, you look to see that in the book, the United States is pretty far down the list out of all the countries that were measured here in women being politically represented. We also see considerable erosion of trust and confidence in the United States, and this is actually shown on table 811, which is shows a year-by-year decline. We see that in 1964, the percent trusting the government to do what is right, it's 76% in 1964, and it wanes and is still waning to this day to 31% in 2008 and has not risen since then. We see that this balance between the support for government and skepticism is hard to maintain, particularly when you have a growing mistrust of government, even when we're nominating candidates that are running on a platform that government can't be trusted, and that emboldens some of those beliefs. And considering government certainly is not perfect, it also is a function of us because we supply people to government. Government is a mirror of its civil society in almost every way, and so therefore you've got some large concerns here. Now, if the country is successful, yeah, there could be what we call rational apathy, to where a person says, "Well, things are going pretty well, so I'm not going to really get too involved or worry too much about it." That could potentially have been an argument in the United States. Harder to make that argument as we are recovering from a sluggish economy, and we can see lots of evidence of growing distrust of government. So what are the conditions for a democratic political culture? What's the relationship between economic prosperity and democracy? And what are some types of authoritarian governments that we talked about in the last chapter? And as we just got through discussing, how are these cultural requirements lacking somewhat as far as in the United States?